recording this computer. All right. So we are recording locally. Sweet. How do you want to start this? I mean, we talk all the time.
Yeah, maybe we should just talk about the technology behind the vaccines first.
Sounds good.
So let's start with the mRNA vaccines. A lot of people think that these vaccines actually have some of the COVID virus in it, whether or not it's a live weakened virus or a dead virus. But, we know that's not the case. The mRNA vaccines, they use mRNA to send a message to the cells of your body to create this shell protein, the spike protein, that your body's immune system will hopefully attack and develop cell immunity to that protein. And so that when you're infected by COVID, hopefully your immune system will attack the COVID virus.
Right.
There's no virus involved in that vaccine. Now, and that's, of course, Moderna and the Pfizer vaccines. With AstraZeneca and Johnson & Johnson, they actually, what that's using is it's a viral vector vaccine. And it's using DNA inside of a weakened or dead adrenovirus, and it's DNA of the spike protein inside of that adrenovirus being delivered into the body, and it's teaching the cells of your body to recognize the DNA of the spike protein, so that when you actually get COVID, it hopefully creates an immune response so that your immune system attacks it. I'm seeing tons of comments on news articles out there, and almost everyone I talk to in the public thinking that these vaccines, they don't understand the technology of the vaccines. They think that it actually is like a traditional vaccine. It's using either a live and weakened virus or a complete dead virus, but neither does that. And both are new technologies. In fact, in 2017, Moderna was saying that they were shelving their mRNA program because in animal testing, because of animal testing results, they concluded that it was non-human viable. And as far as the viral vector vaccine goes, the first viral vector vaccine, even though they've been working on viral vectors since the 70s, the first actually released vaccine that uses a viral vector, which is the same technology that Johnson & Johnson and AstraZeneca uses, came out in 2019, and that was for the Ebola virus.
Right. So these are all, I mean, I'm not saying they're all novel, but for the most part they are.
Right. And I'm seeing lots of people say, oh, well, anyone that doesn't get these vaccines, they're helping the virus mutate because they're the ones that can get the virus still. Like, a lot of people think that just because they've been vaccinated with these vaccines that they can't get the virus. So they still can get the virus. In fact, the CDC and FDA are both saying that we still need to be very precautious if we get the vaccine. We still need to follow guidelines like social distancing and wearing masks and not being around large groups of people. They want you to limit yourself to just gatherings of like one other family within your larger family.
Right.
It's still very much unknown what these vaccines are actually going to do in the long term.
Well, on that note, I mean, I've run into some scenarios that are really scary. I was visiting with a family member, a doctor's office, and the doctor was all ecstatic because they were going to be getting their first dose of one of the mRNA vaccines, and they were so looking forward to seeing their mother again, an elderly mother. And, I was like, well, you need to just make sure that before you do that, your elderly mother is also vaccinated. I've heard stories of people that are already starting to say, I have an immune deficient child. In order for you to come over, you must have the vaccine. And the scary thing to me, knowing that, these vaccines currently, again, they're not FDA approved, they're still in their trial phases, that they're turning around and they're thinking that it's a level of immunity. And they're going to be bringing people who are going to be asymptomatic because they're going to have the vaccine. They're not going to know they're carrying the virus, and they're going to go around these immunodeficient kids. And that just scares me because they're not realizing that the vaccine just makes it so it suppresses the effects so that you hopefully don't die. And it's
Right.
not meant to make you immune.
Right, exactly.
We were talking about the fact that the vaccine is not meant to go back to complete normal. We still have to social distance. We're recommended by the CDC, by WHO, by Dr. Fauci, that just because you have the vaccine doesn't mean there's immunity. There's a lot of unknowns, and the idea of the vaccine is really to suppress the effects that would otherwise put you in the hospital and kill you.
Right, that's exactly right. Yeah, it may turn out that it prevents a number of people from actually getting the virus, but we really don't know that yet because these are still in the trial phases, and they won't. As far as I know, these vaccines won't actually be up for approval until early 2023.
One, I believe, I have to fact check this, but I think Moderna is targeting end of 2022 and Pfizer is targeting the beginning of 2023, or I have them switched. But
right.
They're definitely in trial phase right now.
Well, and the thing that I honestly I don't understand how they're going to be able to move beyond trial phase because there's no longer, they're going to have trouble with their control group. The control group is supposed to be people that in the trials that didn't get the vaccine. And these people, agreed that they wouldn't get the vaccine. But once they were approved for emergency use, there were news stories out saying that a lot of the control group were actually getting vaccinated once it became publicly available. So right now, really, I mean, thankfully, there are people that are resistant to getting this vaccine because they are going to be the control group, I believe, because I don't think there's going to be much of a control group left in these actual trial participants.
Right. One of the things that has bothered me, and just recently I was talking to a friend of mine in Canada, and he had not realized that there was this this liability immunity that vaccine producers have. It was something that was established back in, I think in the late 80s, maybe I think in like 1986, where vaccine producers were not liable for any form of, like lawsuits, things of that nature from people dying from their vaccines. And I know in my business, we have errors and omissions, and we have different kinds of insurance policies that we carry to make sure that whatever the work is that we do, we're doing it to the best of our ability. But if we screw up, if we accidentally hurt something or break something and we cause monetary losses, there's insurance, there's something that backs it. We are liable, we can be sued. And whenever you're producing something, you're trying to do the best you can because you're a good person, but there's also that piece of it that makes you do what you do better. And my friend was like, wow, I didn't realize that was the case. That must be a U.S. thing. And of course, he found the U.S. Policy or act, and then Googled for his own country and realized Canada also has a very similar act as well that protects vaccine producers from being sued.
Right, and I think you'll probably find that most countries do, because otherwise these pharmaceutical companies that develop vaccines would not be providing vaccines for those countries if they didn't provide those assurances.
Well, that makes a lot of sense, though. I can follow that logic. But at the end of the day, if you produce something and it's spread massively and you're not culpable, you're not liable for it, that's kind of a sketchy thing. I mean, that's just it's a difficult thing. You want to see years of testing. You want to see a lot of trials occur.
Right. Yeah, and so you can't sue the vaccine manufacturers, and the government likely won't compensate you for damages either.
What do you mean likely?
Well, Congress created the Countermeasures Injury Compensation Program to help cover lost wages and out-of-pocket medical expenses for people who have been injured or harmed by a vaccine. But it's difficult to use it, and it very rarely pays. Attorneys say it's compensated less than 6% of the claims filed in the last decade. So that's before these COVID-19 vaccines, but it's been very rare historically that they will actually compensate anybody. 6% is minuscule.
I mean, so these pharmaceutical companies that are producing the vaccines also produce traditional medicine, or not traditional medicine, but other drugs. And
some of them. I don't believe Moderna does, but
okay, all right. But like Johnson & Johnson, Pfizer, AstraZeneca, they've all been sued gazillions of times.
Right.
Like major suing, and we're talking about for other drugs, not vaccines.
Right.
So
well, yeah, Johnson & Johnson's been sued for things besides drugs as well.
Okay.
Like talc and talcum powder.
Yep.
Leading to ovarian cancer and things of that sort.
Interesting.
Yeah, there's a long history with these companies of making mistakes, or it might even be it's probably going beyond making mistakes in a number of cases. It's probably just been straight up negligence.
I've actually read some articles on some of the lawsuits that were negligence. They knew going into it that there was a huge risk factor that was going to cause harm, and they went ahead with it. They were caught, and they were then penalized. But again, this was not under the 1986 Vaccine Act, to help protect them. They actually had liability, and they had to pay up.
Right. And the thing is, I mean, again, to reiterate, so many people out there, one, think that these vaccines have already been FDA licensed. They think that FDA emergency use approval equals the same level of oversight as an FDA license, but it definitely does not. I mean, we can discuss that a little bit. I mean, all these vaccines, they've only been approved for emergency use in the U.S. I mean, they have been approved for use in other countries too, but I'm just talking about the U.S. But they haven't been approved for official licensing, and we've talked about how they won't be up for that for a while now. And I think it's great that those that want to get the vaccine have the option to choose to get it under the emergency use authorization. But they should understand the vaccine hasn't officially been licensed by the FDA, and no one should be forced to get an experimental emergency use vaccine or drug. Everybody should have the right over the domain of their body, like in what goes into it. It should be an individual choice, but you have like voices out there getting louder and louder demanding that people are forced to get the vaccine, or they no longer have the rights to access things that people have the rights to access based on the US Constitution.
Which is a form of discrimination.
Oh yeah, it's very much a form of discrimination.
So looking at this, I've had some interesting. So we're talking here a little bit about the risk. It's a risk play at some point, right? You've got this virus out there that's dangerous to a certain segment of people. Technically, it could be dangerous to anybody of any segment, but for the most part, it's elderly people or people who have some form of current issue that combined with this could cause death or could cause some sort of long-term effect. And then you've got on the other side of the equation, you've got a vaccine or set of vaccines that, in light of what we've recently seen with respect to blood clotting and things of that nature, where we were hearing virologists early in the year, warning of this before the AstraZeneca and now the Johnson & Johnson pieces have come out, where you have this riskier experimental drug that hasn't necessarily gone through FDA approval. And we're currently in the trials, and currently those that are not vaccinated are kind of the control group, not necessarily a good control group because they're not being monitored and there's not necessarily data being collected around those people, but it's a risk and rewards kind of thing, and I get the idea of people that are high risk getting this vaccine or getting these vaccines in some cases, but there's also been some research that I've been reading that talks to the demographic that's mostly hit with COVID ends up being the one that these vaccines don't necessarily work as effectively with.
Right. Yes. The older you are, I mean, it's kind of ironic because the older you are, typically the less effective a vaccine is in getting an immune response from your immune system. Younger people tend to have a much stronger response to vaccines, so therefore it's more effective with them. But they're also the least affected by viruses typically.
Right. So so this is on the vaccine side. Now, I also know on the vaccine side, the Harvard did a study on the likelihood of people to respond to the National Vaccine Adverse Events Report Systems, the VAERS. I don't know how to say it. And how it's
and that's just to clarify, that report system is a collaboration between the CDC and the FDA.
And it is voluntary.
Yep. In like doctors, medical professionals, and patients report symptoms and side effects to vaccines there.
And you're looking at the numbers that Harvard came back with was they 0.8 to 2%, 0.8 to 2% people actually report of cases actually are reported. Meaning you go get a vaccine or you go get anything, whatever it might be, and you have a negative effect a few days later, the day of, a month later, you're not likely to report that incident. So the numbers that you see on the VAERS system are much smaller than what those numbers actually are. Right. And there's a lot of side effects. There's a lot of things that have been happening, and some of them are very minor, meaning someone gets a shot, 2 days later, they've got a temperature of 103, they're sick as a dog, but then 2 days later, 3 days later, they're back to normal.
Right.
And then some of them are far more, again, there are situations where you can't necessarily, like if someone passes away, has a heart attack a few days later, there's no way currently to know that heart attack correlates to that vaccine.
Right.
And that's a problem.
Well, it's interesting too, because, if if someone dies, weeks or months later from, and they're already over COVID-19, if they had COVID and they're already over it, if they die a long time later, they can still be labeled as a COVID death.
So there are some. I actually have personally have had this happen, but there are countries that have come out and specifically said it on a lot of their stuff that says, "Hey, here's the death count and they also in subtext underneath it say having had COVID at any point in time." So I had a situation where I had a family member who was fighting cancer, had been fighting cancer for a little bit of time. We were trying to get this person in to get vitamin C treatments, to try to just see like infusions to see if we could give them a chance to survive. They were going through a bad bout, had to go to the emergency room on a Friday night. The family member and the spouse went to the emergency room. They were both tested for COVID. They were both negative. IVs, liquids, just making sure everything was good for 5 days. At the end of 5 days, they were tested on the way out. The next day, they got a call that their test on the way out was positive. Subsequently, they got a test that day and a test the next day and a test 3 days later. They were all negative. But because of that false positive, they were no longer able to receive treatment for those 2 weeks because that was the policy in that state. Subsequently, multi-months later, they passed away from the cancer. And they were marked and flagged as a COVID death.
Yeah.
That's just,
it's crazy.
I don't know that. I mean, I could tell you the handful of times that I've been to the hospital because of the flu, where my temp was 104 and I was very dehydrated, and I was in the hospital saying, "Do you want to test me for the flu?" And they're like, "No, because we're going to give you the same course of action, Tylenol, ibuprofen, and send you home." They gave me some IV. I was there for a few hours. I went home. They never cataloged me as a influenza patient.
Right.
And meanwhile now, like, you get tagged as this, and then you die 3 months later for a completely different situation, and you were considered a COVID death. So where I get is the numbers were skewed.
Yep.
And without
and a lot of people think that those sorts of stories are made up, and I've heard tons of those anecdotal stories. But I know over in England, right on I believe it's on the BBC broadcast. Maybe we could get a screenshot of that somewhere. But what it says is that people who have COVID can be and they get over COVID. 30 days later, if they die of something else, it can still be labeled as a COVID death.
Right. Well, and I'll tell you what, here in the States, this was multi-months.
Yep. And just to go back to, you were talking about the vaccine adverse event reporting system.
Yep.
That's what it's called, and it's co-managed by the CDC and FDA. The acronym for that is V as in Victor, AERS. And hopefully, I think what we'll probably end up doing when we post this audio, maybe in the description, we'll have links to some of our sources so that people, have proof that, we're not just fabricating all this information off the top of our heads. It's actually from real, legitimate sources, not like conspiracy theory websites. It's from actual news sources. Yeah, it's there's just a lot of very interesting stuff around this whole thing. To get back to the emergency access mechanism that these vaccines are available under, it's supposed to be the FDA may issue the emergency use when certain criteria are met, which include that there are no adequate approved available alternatives. But the thing is, there are actually a number of alternatives that you barely hear people talking about, including the media. In fact, some of it I've seen labeled as conspiracy theory, like quackery, nonsense sort of stuff. I mean, vitamin D, it's been proven that people that have vitamin D deficiency, and it's the majority of, by far the majority of the population are deficient in vitamin D. Vitamin D will help people fight off COVID. Zinc, quercetin, vitamin C, ivermectin, which is a drug that's been around for a long time. It's an anti-parasitic. It's often used on lice. Has been shown to be very successful in treating COVID, especially in the early stages. I believe there's a hospital out in Milwaukee. I might be wrong about that, where the doctor actually spoke in front of the Senate talking about how they had been treating tons of people with ivermectin, and it was very, very effective. There's new research showing that older people can take this inhaler at home to help fight off more extreme symptoms so that they don't have to go to the hospital. It's called, I probably won't pronounce this right, but it's a budesonide. And that's typically an inhaler that people take for asthma. There was an article in the BBC about this recently. The thing is, I believe it was 2017, Johns Hopkins University was involved in a simulation. They were simulating the scenario of a pandemic, and one of the things they talked about in the pandemic scenario was that it would be very likely that the FDA would rush through treatments under emergency use, and it would be a big mistake. That they would end up discovering side effects that were not discovered in rush trials. I think that what they referred to this virus in the pandemic simulation that they were doing, they referred to, oh, here it is. Okay, so Johns Hopkins in 2017, they had this SPARS scenario simulation and warned that vaccines and drugs would be dangerously approved for emergency use during a pandemic outbreak. And you can still find this information. I believe it's in a PDF on a Johns Hopkins website, and that's a link that I can provide to you. Mm-hmm. And the thing is, another thing about these vaccines too is, it's estimated that there's 23 to 30 million people in the United States that have autoimmune disorders. And then, what about the ones that we don't know about? Like we were talking earlier, like a lot of people don't report like side effects or symptoms to the VAERS system, to the CDC and the FDA, because we don't end up knowing about so many people who have issues. I mean, it's just like, tons of people that get sick and they don't bother going to the doctors.
Right.
Because, people just try to avoid, like some people try to avoid like seeming like they're complaining or being weak. There's all sorts of that out there, that they don't want to appear like they're being dramatic, and that they just need to be, they just need to toughen up. That's what a lot of people view about, that's how a lot of people view symptoms. And another thing is, research has shown that 40 to 60% of unexposed individuals to COVID already have some sort of immunity to COVID-19. So we're giving people these vaccines, many of them very likely don't even need it. And in fact, it's probably dangerous for a lot of them to get the vaccines if they have immune disorders or they already have some sort of natural immunity they've developed. Yeah, but we're not screening people. We're just giving everybody who wants a vaccine, we're giving it to them, even people who already had COVID.
I've met now with many people, or I've talked to many people who have had COVID, and they've had, end of last year, they had no taste, no smell, sick as a dog, horrible experience, and they rebound, they're good, and they just had their first, or they just had their second shot. of the vaccine. And they've
Right.
dealt with whatever side effects they were dealing with at that moment in time. You know, luckily, knock on wood, everyone I've dealt with, it's been mild to, you know, to moderate stuff. But they're doing it because they know they want to be able to travel. They're doing it because they know they feel as though without that card, they are not going to be able to be a productive member of society. But meanwhile, they've had probably the best dose of immune system boosting that they're ever going to have with that virus.
Right.
There's no
And
screening.
I even hear people falsely claim that it's better to get the vaccine, that's going to be more effective than actually getting the virus. Even though when you're exposed to the virus itself, you're exposed to the virus's entire DNA.
Yeah, a
You're
ton of
not in the
genetic
vaccine.
material. Right. It doesn't really make much sense. So part of me, it's why this transparent, the numbers are so important. If you've got someone who has COVID and had COVID 3 months ago and then dies from cancer, and you mark that as a COVID death, two things occur. One, you're scaring people with that death count because that was not COVID that killed that person. And two, you're breaking the numbers down to the point where you can't accurately make a decision whether or not you want the vaccine because you don't know how dangerous the virus is.
Right.
You know, and again, for certain types of people, the vaccine may be the exact thing they need, but you just need the numbers. And again, I know half the numbers are brand new, and we're just started giving vaccines out in the last few months, and you know the testing has only been going on for a few months beyond that, but. That's why I hate when the numbers are messed up. And on the numbers being messed up, same side of things, I know another person, again, family. They live in an area where there's many states around each other, where many people work in one state but live in another state. And they are actually someone who someone reached out and said, hey, someone at some place that you were at had COVID. So they went and got tested near their place of work at one of those like CVS drive-up rapid tests. The test came back positive. They were confused because they also had thought that the vaccine would make them immune. But they were just because of their job, they wanted to get tested to verify that they were good. And that led to them getting tested again 30 minutes later. Rapid test as well as a PCR test, both came back negative. They then got tested again 3 days later. Both tests came back negative. So it was obviously a false positive. In the state where they work, they were contacted by the contact tracing group, who did not receive the negative results because the place that they got negative results from were told only communicate with the state positives, not negatives. So there are many other people that probably fell in the same bucket of getting a positive at a CVS, and they went to this particular place to get tested, got a negative there, but the negative never made its way back up to the state. The state wanted to consider it a positive. The state actually even said to this person, there's no such thing as a false positive, there's only false negatives. We want your
very untrue.
we want your contact list. And your contact list was everybody at that event, everybody in, you know, that anyone you met with in the last 14 days. Looking up online, their state policy was within 6 feet for over 15 minutes. And that list went from 50 people down to 5 people that person worked with. Right. However, that person also knew of the other person who had died last year and with cancer, but with COVID from the state level, and said, I don't want this to be a positive until you get all the negative information. Subsequently, the state they actually lived in called them as well. They had gotten notification from the state they got tested in that they were positive and wanted to do contact tracing. They were informed what was going on, and the state was confused, like, well, why didn't this other state give us the negatives too? They had to reach out with their data team, collect the data, come back and say, you know what, guys, it's a false positive. It's off the books. We're not going to worry about it. But if this person wasn't so insistent, it would have been 2 false positives for one situation across those states.
Yeah, and I mean, honestly, how do we really even know that they changed those to false positives?
Yeah.
It might not have been subtracted from the total. And the fact
Again,
that they
it's skewing the numbers. That's the problem.
oh yeah, it's skewing the numbers big time, especially if people are testing positive and then they get tested later on and it shows negative. A lot of those cases are probably just thinking, oh, well, the person got over COVID.
Right.
And the fact that these experts, these professionals claim that there aren't false positives is completely false. Right on FDA.gov, they say potential for false positive results with antigen tests for rapid detection of SARS-CoV-2. It's very, very likely that those can occur.
Which testing was that? Because I know the PCR testing. I know the creator of that had gone out and saying this type of testing is not meant for that. PCR testing is not meant for this, and the amplification they needed in order, or that they were recommending, that the WHO and CDC were recommending, was so high that false positives were a serious issue, to the point where the CDC lowered its guidelines and the WHO said, we are recommending no longer having a positive PCR as being adequate, that we want a positive PCR as well as symptoms to say that you've got COVID. That's some pretty crazy.
Yeah, so it definitely is. So this is exactly what it says. It says, consider the CDC's recommendations when using antigen testing in nursing homes and other settings. For positive results, especially in low incidence counties, consider performing confirmatory RT-PCR tests within 48 hours. Remember that positive predictive value varies with disease prevalence when interpreting results from diagnostic tests. PPV is the percent of positive test results that are true positives. As disease prevalence decreases, the percent of test results that are false positives increase. For example, a test with 98% I can't say it. Specificity would have a PPV of just over 80% in a population with 10% prevalence, meaning 20 out of 100 positive results would be false positives. The same test would only have a PPV of approximately 30% in a population with 1% prevalence, meaning 70 out of 100 positive results would be false positives. This means that in a population with 1% prevalence, only 30% of individuals with positive test results actually have the disease. This is right on the FDA site.
I mean, dude, take that and the story I had just said before, and think of those two contact tracers across 2 states reaching out to all those individuals, had they, and all of those individuals went out, could have gone out and had to been quarantined or tested, right? And then if they were false positives, they would have gone out and there would have been contact tracing done on them. I mean, that's astronomical. I mean, even the CDC's website from April 2020, November 3rd, they have a vital statistics reference guidance document. And they specifically state in there, as clinical guidance on, let's see. All right. The purpose of this report is to provide guidance on death certifiers on proper cause of death certification for viruses where confirmed or suspected COVID-19 infection resulted in death. You could have had a heart attack and been coughing on your way into the hospital, died, and they would have said it was a COVID-19 death. There was no testing requirement in order to write COVID-19 on the certificate.
Right.
That's a CDC guideline.
Right. And do you know if have they changed that now?
I'm looking. I did a search for. I did a search. I went to their reporting and coding deaths due to COVID-19, and it's the first article they've got on their page that I clicked to was the one from that date.
And again, I want to reiterate. I think it's great that anybody that wants to take these vaccines is able to take it by their own choice, as soon as it's available in the area. A lot of areas have had issues with availability, but it should be their choice, and they should be making that choice based on the actual truth, like actually knowing that you can still get COVID and you're still going to have to follow safety guidelines that the CDC recommends. Still going to have to wear a mask, like when out in public places. You're going to have to social distance. And they should also know that they can still give the virus to people. They should know it's still in experimental phase.
Yep.
And another thing I want to talk about with vaccines, especially with like viruses like COVID-19, there's something called vaccine-induced enhancement, or antibody-dependent enhancement. It's when vaccines cause people to be more susceptible to the virus. Like they get a vaccine and it makes them even more susceptible to the virus. Examples of viruses that have had this issue: HIV and AIDS. That's a huge reason why it's been so difficult to develop a vaccine for HIV and AIDS. The dengue virus for dengue fever. We've had huge issues with certain coronaviruses. COVID is a coronavirus. The flavivirus, the paramyxovirus, lentivirus vaccine development, all of those have had huge issues with vaccine development because they end up causing vaccine-induced enhancement. So you have people getting these vaccines, and it's possible they could catch the virus. And we've had issues with developing COVID vaccines in the past. That's why we've never had one. And so you could have people get sick with COVID after they've been vaccinated, and it could actually, we don't have any reported cases of this yet, but these vaccines are very new. As these viruses mutate, you could end up having more severe cases because people are vaccinated. And these aren't really, again, I want to reiterate, especially the Pfizer and the Moderna vaccines are not really vaccines. By the traditional definition of vaccines, they're more a gene therapy. The traditional definition of a vaccine is you have a weakened live virus or a dead virus that causes an immune response to someone's body, in someone's body, and that's not what these are.
And correct me if I'm wrong, but in that situation, your body starts to create antibodies, your T cell immunity starts to learn and understand how to approach this virus, and then your antibodies fade away a bit over time until the next situation that you might have to encounter this particular virus. Your T cell immunity helps produce antibodies, et cetera, and fights the virus. So I've heard a lot of people say that, getting the virus, you're only good for 3 months, from an immunity perspective. And, I've listened to virologists that talk about, the fact that it's truly about your T cell immunity, more so than about the antibodies that are being produced at the time of incident. I've also read some interesting stuff around the mutations, and at the level of the mutations, our immune system should be able to, if our immune system is properly being treated, should be able to handle that. There was a gentleman who mentioned, the equivalency of taking a family member, who's wearing a ball cap and spin the ball cap around. It's the same person. You recognize the person, your immune system's going to recognize the variant. It requires a plus 20% change in order for your immune system to not recognize it. And so there's a lot of people that have fear that they've gotten the virus, they've gotten through the virus, and they feel like there's only a 3-month immune system. And now on top of all of this stuff, where we have this emergency trial phase on these mRNA therapies, as well as these vaccines, now they're talking about booster shots. I saw this morning an article where the head of Moderna was like, hey, we'll have a booster by end of year.
Right.
And wasn't there something around the booster shots not requiring as much testing as the emergency vaccines?
Yes, yes, there is. I mean, there's already less stringent regulations on vaccines than there are other drugs. But these emergency use vaccines have even less restrictions than a vaccine that would go under like longer trial.
Right.
And to be clear, again, yes, the Moderna and Pfizer vaccines, they're not really vaccines. They're gene therapy. They're not using any of the virus dead or alive in it. But I would argue that even the AstraZeneca and Johnson & Johnson vaccines are still not traditional vaccines because they don't include the actual virus. It's just DNA from the spike protein of the virus. It's not the whole virus. Whereas if you get sick with COVID, you're exposed to the entire DNA of the virus.
I just wish they could have. I wish they. Some that nags me about, I just wish they would have actually used the actual virus and not. I mean, we've had vaccines for how many years?
Yeah, I'm not really sure why they haven't. I thought that I had heard Novavax is working on one that uses the actual virus.
Yep.
But I haven't really heard much for an update on those.
Yeah.
But we had a doctor come out in December, like I believe he wrote a letter to the FDA or CDC about how he had major concerns about using the spike protein in the vaccine because there's a lot of evidence that shows like these long haulers, people that have these like permanent damage symptoms from COVID, it's actually the spike protein that's causing the most severe damage to organs like the heart, the liver, the lungs, the brain, and he was concerned that yet here we are, we're using that same, we're giving the messenger RNA, we're injecting it into people's bodies, and it's providing the body with the message that it needs to create the spike protein. And when the body creates spike protein, the immune system really, really attacks. And that could be why you have a lot of people reporting like things like increased blood pressure, very rapid heart rates after getting the vaccine. Right. And I've heard tons of anecdotal accounts of people dying of heart attacks, and strokes and blood clots not long after getting the vaccine. But again, the CDC and FDA aren't going to attribute that, and neither are the manufacturers going to contribute that or attribute that to the vaccines because it didn't happen like there at the office when right after the injection.
Right. I mean, you see what happens when just 6 people report clotting situations. Just 6 people, right? And I'm doing that in air quotes, but 6 people in Georgia, and they end up stopping it in the entire country. 6 people out of 6 million, right? Yeah. So you can imagine if heart attacks were somehow associated, you know what I mean? Like, yeah. So talk about hesitancy. I mean, that's what I
really don't think they stopped it just for 6 people.
Okay.
And all those 6 people, I believe, correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe all 6 of those people were in Georgia.
Yes, they were. Just that state.
Right. I find it very surprising that they would stop it nationwide because of 6 cases in Georgia.
Well, we also know that AstraZeneca got paused from a bunch of countries for similar situations.
Oh yeah.
We had.
We wouldn't even allow it in the U.S. And it was allowed in many European countries and got put on pause.
Right. We did buy a bunch though.
Yeah, and it got sent to Canada. Yeah, and that's the only I believe that's the only vaccine they have there right now is the AstraZeneca vaccine.
Yeah. Crazy.
And that doctor that I was talking about, he's not just some doctor. He's very reputable. He has a very nice resume. His name's John Patrick Whelan, MD PhD. Um, he's his specialty is pediatrics, rheumatology, internal medicine. He specializes in inflammation. Rheumatology is very focused on inflammation. So he's very familiar with, inflammation and immune response and what causes inflammation in the body. And he had major concerns about using the spike protein, generating the spike protein with the vaccine. He even, if you go out and read that letter that he wrote, he cited all the research that showed in lab experiments that the spike protein was causing permanent damage to kidneys, liver, lungs, heart, brain. I believe a lot of those experiments were in lab animals, but that's where all this, should have been spending a great deal of time. We've really rushed through all of this. And I just want to say, I've had pretty much every single other vaccine, in my life. These are the only ones that I'm really super reluctant on. But the more I've been learning about these vaccines, I mean, with what's happened with these vaccines, it makes me more suspicious of other vaccines now.
You
But
you did mention though, again, I mean, you talk about vaccine hesitancy. It's the title that's on so many places right now on the media outlets.
yeah.
The concern
Well,
around.
I'm getting called an anti-vaxxer by people just because I'm reluctant on these vaccines because of how quickly they've been rushed through.
Well, okay. So let me be very clear. Like, you've had pretty much all the vaccines that are needed to have, and we now have this rushed vaccine. I mean, it was as rushed can be. I mean, the amount of time it took them to say something's completely non-viable to then kick off this vaccine is incredible light speed. Warp speed, I think, is the term that was being used.
Yep.
There was a situation back a few years ago. Was it in the Philippines? Was it the dengue fever one?
Yes. Yeah.
They produced a vaccine. There was a gentleman who worked in the military studying in the veteran side, studying this stuff for like 50 years. He had huge concerns about the paperwork about doing this vaccine. They did the vaccine, and what they found was those that already had the fever, the kids that had the fever, were in bad shape with this vaccine. And by the time that people started realizing that there was a bad situation going on, it was too late. So many people already had the vaccine.
Yeah.
You see that stuff make its way to the front of the papers. You see that information go out there. You see doctors jumping up and down. We've had doctors jumping up and down now the last year on half the stuff that's been going on.
Yeah.
And I don't care if you've had every vaccine on the planet. You're probably going to sit there and say, all right, so should I take this or should I not? It's been rushed. We know in the prior experiments that have gone on, even with a little bit more time, there's been potential issues. You want good data, So I would not consider you an anti-vaxxer in any shape or form.
Right, but that all of this, everything that's gone on over the past basically since Trump was elected in 2016, everything's been politicized, and this virus has been politicized. All the treatments have been politicized, and back to the dengue fever incident. That military doctor, he had studied dengue fever for more than 50 years with the U.S. military. His name was Dr. Scott Halstead. When he went to the developer of the vaccine, they basically laughed at him and said, no, that's not possible. That's not going to be an issue. It's not the problem. That was a French pharmaceutical company. I'm not going to name any names. You can find it out there. This is from an NPR article. It's where I found it. But they ended up going ahead and vaccinating more than 100,000 Philippine children were vaccinated. And I did find it. That's exactly what it says. More than 100,000 were vaccinated. And they were being investigated for actually causing the death. It was proven that it caused the death of over 300 kids. And at the time of this article being written, which I believe was in 2018, they were already looking at like over 600 deaths potentially being caused by it total. But I don't know what the actual number ended up being. It could have been way more than that.
But what you look at though, or the biggest confusion I've had and the biggest problem I've had is bloated number sets. So people are like, well, maybe someone could say, well, 600 or 300 is better than what the fever itself could kill.
Right, but that's why I hear the same argument by people who are pro these lockdowns. Like, well, we shouldn't be accepting anybody dying from this virus. Well, if we're not supposed to be accepting any deaths from the virus, why are we supposed to be accepting any deaths from the vaccine?
Right.
Yeah, and it's.
Do you know what's the latest number that VAERS has for deaths regarding the vaccines? Do you know that number?
Like people that are that died after getting the vaccine. I might not be remembering this exactly. I believe it was something like 3,000.
Yeah, it was 2,000 or 3,000. And when you start looking at, and you look at all the symptoms, because the virus holds all symptoms, and
you can find that right on the CDC or FDA website.
Right, well. And if you look at the non-deaths, but like the severe numbers are pretty incredible as well, and that's only like 0.8 to 2% reporting based on the Harvard study. Right. So I'm not going to say that deaths are in the same bracket as people not reporting, like being extremely sick and having all sorts of other symptoms and issues. But
and let's be clear, a great majority of the people that have died from COVID have had at least, I believe it's at least 2 comorbidities.
Mm-hmm.
And that's another thing. People are like, we need to get everybody vaccinated. That's how we're going to fight this virus. And everybody has to take the vaccine whether they want to or not. And if they don't, we need to punish them by limiting access to different resources.
Right.
But you don't hear that same attitude when it comes to people like taking care of themselves and not eating bad food and getting good exercise and decreasing inflammation that happens in the body because of bad diets and bad habits. You even have companies offering free donuts and beer after getting the vaccine. Which we both know beer and donuts very, very much a health food product, right?
Well, yeah. The particular donut manufacturer you're talking about is the ultimate health product.
Well, yeah, and don't get me wrong, I like to have beer sometimes, and I like to have donuts sometimes, but I don't. We live in a very hypocritical society. I don't want to force people on diets. And I don't want to force people to get vaccines. I think it should be a choice. I think just like it should be a choice, pregnancy should be a choice. I might not agree with everybody's decision, but I don't believe it's up to me to tell people what they should do with their lives and bodies.
I do really wish, though, that we, going back a year, when we got those original stimulus checks, I kind of wish that those stimulus checks were $25 short and they gave you 6 months supply of vitamin D3.
Yeah, I don't get why they're not talking about that as much. I mean, I think it has been reported, vitamin D3 a little bit in recent months, but it hasn't been like vaccine has been, Yeah. And we've had vitamin D3 for much longer than these vaccines. And we've had a deficiency in vitamin D3 for much longer.
Yeah,
Uh,
for a long time, ever since we started doing 9 to 5s and working indoors and
yeah, and wearing sunscreen. We wear sunscreen to prevent skin cancer, but that makes us much weaker immune system wise and health wise. And the other supplements that I mentioned, like you're hearing practically no mention of. And in fact, India, the country of India was they were as part of their treatment. The main part of their treatment was zinc, quercetin, and ivermectin.
yep. I mean, so the gentleman that you were talking about, I'll definitely try to link to the when he was in front of the House speaking. He represented a very large group of doctors, one of the largest, and scientists, and they were studying existing medicines. And there's a term for that. I don't recall it, but that's what they were focusing. And they were like one of the only organizations in the world focused on that.
Well, that's really that should have been a huge priority. Just as I think it should be a huge priority to test people for T cell antibodies, immunity, and testing people for these things to know who's at the greatest risk. But we spent all this money on like ventilators and masks, and that that takes us back to like what this whole thing, the lockdowns and everything, was originally meant to lessen the strain on the hospital system.
Right.
And we were focused on hospital people that had to go to the hospital. We wanted to lessen that, and deaths. And now that hospitalizations have decreased and deaths have the rates of these things have decreased, you're seeing the media focus more on case numbers. And again, I want to say that all of these numbers, including deaths, are suspect. And I've even been seeing news reports recently say, oh, well, hey, surprise, surprise, guess what? It's a shock, but suicides were down last year, even though suicides have been going up, skyrocketing basically since 2008, the suicide rate. But somehow last year, during all this craziness, they're trying to claim that suicide rates went down. I truly find that hard to believe. Maybe the science actually does prove that, and the statistics prove it. But guess what? Overdoses went up a lot. And I think that overdoses in a lot of cases could be labeled as suicide.
Right.
So you have a lot of manipulation of statistics going on. Right. You should also provide a link to the doctor who wrote the letter about the Larryness of the spike protein.
Yep.
Again, that was John Patrick Whelan, MD PhD, and he was at I believe he was at Mass General for a really long time, and now he's out at UCLA. Is there anything that you think that you've forgotten to mention, or?
I mean, I'm sure more will come up. I would love to have on some of these future ones to look at relevant articles or things that are popping up and just have discussions around them.
Right. A few other quick things I can just run down. Like there was a plant in Baltimore that put the wrong ingredients in millions of Johnson & Johnson vaccines and for the COVID vaccine. And J&J ended up taking over the plant. That's one that a lot of people might be overlooking. And I think it was just over the past couple of days on CBC in Canada, they've been talking about how the government up there is talking, because of the different mutations, different variations of the virus. They're talking about locking down inter-province travel.
Interesting.
Yeah, and I sent that today to some of our Canadian friends to give them a heads up. So very likely soon they might not be able to be traveling in between provinces up there. And,
wow.
And Canada has been you know, we've been bad about this as well, but I feel like Canada has been even more so infringing on people's rights. Like citizens that fly back into the country have been carted away to quarantine facilities that they don't reveal the locations to loved ones. So they have no idea where their loved ones have been carted away to, and they're kept there for 14 days or until I think they've had like 5 consecutive tests that have come back negative.
Wow.
Yeah, and it's I know at one point they were also making people quarantine in hotels when they were getting off the planes, and it was at their own expense, and they were huge expenses, like thousands of dollars. It was like the hotels almost seemed like they were price gouging the situation. I mean, I feel like I could talk about this forever. I'm sure there's been some stuff that I forgot to talk about, but I think we really we covered a lot. Oh, I just thought of one other thing. I don't know if any of the listeners out there heard, but recently a volcano erupted on the island of St. Vincent in the Caribbean. It's I believe it's not too awfully far from Venezuela, but people were only allowed to evacuate from the island. They were evacuating people on cruise ships. They were only allowed to evacuate from the island if they had the COVID vaccine, which is crazy. You know, a volcano has erupted. People can't breathe. This ash is landing on people's houses and collapsing roofs, and they can't see, they can't breathe, and they're not allowed to evacuate unless they have the COVID vaccine. And I will say it's somewhat understandable that that's the case with an island, because if there's a virus outbreak, a major virus outbreak on an island, it's really hard to get supplies to an island. It takes a lot of time. It's very expensive. But they could have evacuated these people to some sort of mainland. Like they could have evacuated them to Venezuela. They could have evacuated them to Florida. We do have exceptions, refugee exceptions, and that sounds like an emergency situation. We could have helped a lot of those people out if they didn't want to stay on the island. And let's be honest. I mean, the vaccine has been hard to get in a lot of places, especially rural places.
Dude, it's about people surviving.
Right, exactly.
Do we think that the COVID virus is more dangerous than a volcano?
Right, yeah, it's nuts.
Like, don't we pick and choose the things that we do to maximize life, like we always have? And now, for some reason, unless you're not vaccinated, you're stuck in a potentially a very likely life-threatening situation. Cool. All right. Well, let's wrap this up, and we'll go from there.